Good day. Good afternoon, everybody. I hope you can hear us, everybody. Could you give me just a sign from those who are following on Zoom that you can hear us? Great, fantastic. A warm welcome to everybody to our lecture, public lecture in the framework of the Law Forum at the University of Akureyri. It's a pleasure to welcome here a scholar and colleague from the United States, Chris Dunn. Chris is a Fulbright scholar at the Arctic Stephenson Institute. His research focuses on the application of environmental humanities to conservation, management, and policy in Iceland. This is his task at the moment, his research. A key aspect of this investigation is the ongoing conflict between conservation and renewable energy development in Iceland's Central Highlands, an issue many of the Icelanders, but also abroad, are aware of this controversy. Christopher completed his PhD in environmental studies at the University of Colorado Boulder in 2021. And besides, he is also a writer, photographer, and outdoor adventurer. And his lecture today will be on wilderness protection, wilderness in Alaska. Yes, the floor is yours. Please.
Okay, thank you for coming, if you're here in person or online. 1 second. Okay, so I'm going to start out with a case study of a wilderness park in Arctic Alaska, and then move into what I call reflections on the broader context of wilderness. And I have a specific angle that I'm doing there. That's going to get a bit more philosophical. So you're kind of getting like two presentations in one, and hopefully I have time for all of it. So this first part was a project that I conducted a number of years ago, and it was a fairly short-term project with a fairly narrow focus. So I'm going to talk about some of the context, and it's very law and policy oriented. So I thought that would be of interest to the Polar Law folks, who are hosting my talk. So thank you again for that also. So it's about Gates of the Arctic National Park, and the project was called Changing Climate, Changing Policies, Subsistence Use and Wilderness Values in Gates of the Arctic National Park. So I'm going to start by giving a background, a geographic orientation briefly to the Arctic and Alaska, a brief history of Inupiat Pass Village where I worked for this, and talk about what is subsistence, including ideas of culture and tradition, talk about parks and wilderness, and then talk about some of the major themes of the interviews that I conducted. And then I'm going to move into part two, which is a dose of wilderness history and philosophy, and then we can have questions. So the Arctic, as you in this room at least probably know, there's no agreed to absolute definition of the Arctic. There are a few, but by any definition of the Arctic, and this is showing a few different renditions of that. And I don't know if anybody can see my mouse, but I like to do the mouse. Nope, nobody can see it. So I don't have the laser pointer either, but the Brooks Range is firmly within the Arctic, and that's this mountain range way at the top of Alaska there below the Colville River. So Gates of the Arctic National Park is that, in the map that I can't point out with my laser pointer or my mouse, is that big green blob below the big yellow blob in the map way over there. And this is a closer map. And so Inupiat Pass Village is a native village, and it's up towards the very top there. And it's full, you see it's fully surrounded by Gates of the Arctic National Park. So Gates of the Arctic is huge. It is, this Zoom thing is blocking my notes. Let's see. It's entirely north of the Arctic Circle in the Central Brooks Range. It's it's part of one of the largest protected ecosystems in the world. The entirety of the Brooks Range is protected into Canada all the way to the Chukchi Sea, basically the Arctic Ocean. And the park itself is over 8.3 million acres, which is about the size of 4 Yellowstones, or the size of Belgium, or about the third of the size of Iceland, or a little shy of what the proposed Central Highland National Park would have been, at least in its size proposed a few years ago. So a quick history of Inupiat Pass in the Brooks Range. The first humans arrived thought to arrive around 13,000 years ago. The Nunamiut Inupiat arrived about 1,250 years ago. In the 1900s, the Nunamiut abandoned the Brooks Range, and that had to do with a few factors. I don't know all the details, but tuberculosis, I think, was a factor. And then also overhunting of caribou due to like market forces and some other things like this. The beginning of the Anaktuvuk resettlement by multiple families was 1949. The village of Anaktuvuk Pass was incorporated in 1957. In 1969, the Hickle Highway, which was the intended pipeline route, was bulldozed through Anaktuvuk Pass. I'll return to that. In 1971, the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act was passed. In the 1970s, the first use of ATVs by the Nunamiut, or all-terrain vehicles, which is part of what I'm going to talk about. The Trans-Alaska Pipeline was completed in 1977. Gates of the Arctic National Monument was instituted by then President Jimmy Carter in 1978. In 1980, the Alaska Natural Interest Lands Conservation Act was passed, which created Gates of the Arctic National Park, along with a lot of other parks in Alaska. And in 1996, there was something called the Anaktuvuk Pass Land Exchange Act. So the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act, among other things, extinguished all Aboriginal claims to lands and hunting and fishing rights, while creating native, regional, and village corporations that were given land rights and monetary compensation, but also the obligation to integrate into markets and seek profits, significantly altering the relationship that Alaska Native peoples have with their traditional lands. And these maps that you see on the side, one are the Native Corporation lands that were created after the Settlement Act, and the other, it's overlaid with a linguistic map of Alaska. And then you'll see the smaller map of Gates of the Arctic. It shows the 11 subsistence communities around Gates of the Arctic. So each of these communities, the residents of these communities, have subsistence access rights to the park. And there are other parks in Alaska that have similar arrangements. So I'm going to give a little backdrop to the idea of wilderness in Alaska. So well before any of this, there were what I call dreams of mega developments in Alaska. And there were some really outlandish ideas, really huge ideas. One was this, what's called the Rampart Dam, which would have dammed the Yukon, which is one of the largest rivers in the United States. And it would have created this reservoir that would have been, you can see, extremely massive. I don't know the acreage, but huge. Another idea was to use nuclear weapons to excavate a harbor somewhere in the northwest coast of Alaska. And the Hickle Highway was sort of in the pipeline, sort of followed these dreams of mega developments, I would say. So there was kind of this limbo period between the discovery of oil on the north coast of Alaska and these settlements and conservation laws, where the then Governor Hickle of Alaska said, I'm just going to take advantage of this sort of gray zone and just build the road that I want the pipeline to run, because this is going to happen. So he sent bulldozers up all the way up through the Brooks Range to the north slope, and it went right through Anaktuvuk Pass. Now, this road was a total disaster because all it did was it scraped away the top layer of permafrost, and it quickly just melted away and was unusable immediately. But it just showed kind of the gaudiness of the time. And these are pictures from that time. So some of this continues today. One of the big controversies in the area now, or big potential developments, is what's called the Ambler mining road, which would lead to the Ambler mining district. And this is immediately south of the park and would actually cut through the preserve, which hangs down from the park. Basically, this was grandfathered in to or not grandfathered in, but it was baked into ANILCA. It was sort of a compromise that this mining district could potentially be accessed someday. Even more ambitious, this was from 2017. I have no idea how realistic some of these ideas are, but just to give you a sense of sort of the dreams that took place and still take place. Alaska hatches plan for vast road network across the Arctic, which would go all through the North Slope. This doesn't actually show the Ambler Road. And even more unlikely, especially now, but equally ambitious, is this article that came out a few years ago. Apparently, Russia had an idea that Russia greenlights 65 billion Siberia-Alaska rail and tunnel to bridge the Bering Strait. And this shows like a rendition of what that could look like. Probably never was a real idea, but interesting, and it reflects the same kind of thinking. But what is actually happening for sure are deep water ports. There's been one that's green-lighted. It's definitely going to happen in Nome, but there are ideas to potentially have deep water ports all along the coast of Alaska. So a last bit of geographic orientation, and then I should say, then there's oil development. So Prudhoe Bay led to a lot of oil development, and this kind of this orange color indicates the extent of some of that. And there are more ideas to develop more areas there. And the one that's been controversial and that you probably have heard of is the 1002 area, or the North Slope of the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. It was meant to be, when Anoka was passed, it was basically meant to be settled within, I think they thought, months. But 40 plus years later, it's been it's kind of an emblematic symptom of partisan politics in the US. And it's a tug of war over what to do with resources, like develop it for oil or leave it for wilderness. It also happens to be the calving ground for the portions of 2 large caribou herds, and which are depended on by especially Gwich'in people. So this shows a map of some of these herds. There's 4 main caribou herds in Alaska, and 3 of them you'll see cover the Anaktuvuk Pass area, but none of them actually anymore go right through Anaktuvuk Pass, and I'll briefly address that later. But the calving grounds, as you can see in this map here, are on that one, in that so-called 1002 area, and then the caribou migrate basically over the Brooks Range and winter in the forest south of the range. So this is a zoom-in map of Anaktuvuk Pass. And as you can see, it's surrounded by Native Corporation-owned lands with public access, with some interspersed private lands. And this green is National Park Service non-wilderness lands, which are open to basically ATVs or motorized vehicles for subsistence use. And then this land all to the north is BLM land. So there are subsistence corridors that the people of Anaktuvuk Pass can use for subsistence use in the park on their own lands, and then they can access the BLM lands, which they can also use to the north. So this current map was the final result of a 4-way land exchange between the National Park Service, the Arctic Slope Regional Corporation, the Nunamiut Corporation, and ultimately the BLM. And it was in process from basically the 80s, but it was culminated in 1996 with the Omnibus Parks and Public Lands Management Act of 1996. And it created these subsistence corridor, and it equalized the acreage of designated and undesignated wilderness. So some wilderness got swapped around so that this could happen. So what is subsistence? Well, a rough definition is that subsistence allows for direct use. It's direct dependence on wildlands or waterways for consumption and economic livelihood. The Anoka definition is the customary and traditional uses by rural Alaska residents of wild renewable resources for direct personal or family consumption as food, shelter, fuel, clothing, tools, or transportation, for the making and selling of handicraft byproducts of fish and wildlife resources taken for personal or family consumption, and for customary trade. So one thing to note there is it says rural Alaska residents. It doesn't say native residents. So that's something to pay attention to in Anoka. So subsistence is direct consumption for eating. So this is a potlatch in Anaktuvuk Pass. These are not my photos, but it's like a ceremonial gathering. Or this maktuk, which is not available in the Brooks Range, but nearby in the North Slope. It's basically whale meat. And a resident of Anaktuvuk Pass shared a bit with me. So there's some still ongoing trade network between the North and the Brooks Range, which has actually been in place for a very long time. Subsistence is also economic. Goods that are gathered can be used for sale or barter. And so Anaktuvuk Pass, along with native communities basically throughout Alaska, have what we would call a mixed economy. These masks are actually Anaktuvuk Pass's sort of innovative native handicraft. They're caribou skin masks with fur outlines, and they're quite valued by but I guess you would say people who appreciate native crafts. And this stand was actually at the World Eskimo Indian Olympics, where all kinds of native artists were selling various crafts. And when these are sold, so often they're used to, for instance, repair these Argos, which are the 8-wheel vehicles that residents of Anaktuvuk Pass really like to use, and for fuel, which you can see. I took this because I thought it was astoundingly expensive when I visited, but now, and compared to Iceland, this is like a deal. So I was like, oh, I need a new picture of the price, but I'm not there and I can't do it. And you still wouldn't be impressed. You'd be like, oh, that's cheap. So anyway, the effect is sort of lost on that. But and subsistence is also culture. So this is especially reflected here in the World Eskimo Indian Olympics, which is held every year in Fairbanks, and it's kind of a pan-Arctic event. And there are all kinds of unique events that all relate to traditional subsistence use of the land. For instance, this blanket toss. This was an innovative idea to basically get advantage of the ocean at a very flat place, for instance, like on the North Slope of Alaska. And then you could scan for whales out on the horizon and say, oh, maybe we want to go out there and hunt. And there's this highlight kick. It's like, what does that have to do with subsistence? Well, apparently just like the strength and the endurance that you need to be out on the land, like it connects indirectly sometimes in that way. And then like dancing and they're actually skinning seals here. So just a quick policy overview of subsistence in Gates of the Arctic. Subsistence use is permitted in the entirety of Gates of the Arctic by resident zone communities, I should have added. Snow machine access is permitted in the entirety of Gates of the Arctic when there's good snow cover for subsistence access. Motorboat access is permitted for subsistence access, but in the immediate area of Inupiat Pass, because it's on a pass, the rivers are too small, so they are not using motorboats unless they're making it somewhere else where they can do so, but other communities are. Subsistence rights apply to all rural residents in subsistence communities, not just native, to ensure survival of physical, economic, and traditional existence, though ANILCA specifically mentions native cultural survival. Excuse me. And one of the management mechanisms is what's called subsistence resource commissions, which provides local subsistence users an opportunity to inform the management of subsistence resources in Gates of the Arctic and the surrounding area. And what you're seeing in this picture here are the truly traditional means of access and transport in the Brooks Range by the Nunamiut. And you can see it's basically being on foot and also having dogs with little packs attached to them. It was a way they would get around. So what we're having an interface basically of subsistence and wilderness and native cultures and wilderness. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what is wilderness. And these aren't legal definitions. I'll get into the Wilderness Act in a second, but these are more broad definitions. The first defines it as the term wilderness has several dimensions: a biological dimension, because wilderness mainly refers mainly to ecologically intact areas, and a social dimension, because many people from urban dwellers to indigenous groups interact with wild nature, and all humans depend on our planet's wilderness resource to varying degrees. A wilderness protected area is therefore an area that is mainly biologically intact, is free of modern industrial infrastructure, and has been set aside so that humans may continue to have a relationship with wild nature. And just really quickly, I'll highlight in this second definition a statement: these areas do not exclude people, as many are in fact critical to certain communities, including indigenous peoples. So I just want to highlight that because it's a common misunderstanding, and I'm going to talk about that in the second part if I have time for it, that wilderness excludes people or various other comments to that effect. One thing I'll point out, though, in this first definition is that it's a very instrumental definition. Wilderness is there for us to use, and that's true, but you can also define wilderness as having intrinsic values, basically a non-instrumental value. It's valued for its own sake. And just quickly, this is a map of wilderness. You could see, based on these sort of definitions of basically being free from industrial scale impacts and intensive agriculture, for instance. And most of the wilderness left is in the Arctic and Antarctic and in large desert areas and the Amazon. So globally, not that much left. So some things that wilderness is not timeless, except understood experientially. When you're spending time in wilderness, it does have this timeless feel. And it's not untouched, unless understood in relative terms. Basically, a wilderness compared to, for instance, like Manhattan, is relatively untouched. And so people use these adjectives, but we should be careful in what they truly mean and what they don't mean. So the Wilderness Act of 1964 defines wilderness in the United States, and it states, this is just a really, really small piece of it: a wilderness, in contrast with those areas where man and his works dominate the landscape, is hereby recognized as an area where the earth and its community of life are untrammeled by man, where man himself is a visitor who does not remain. And one of the things that the Wilderness Act mandates is that what's called wilderness character, is preserved. And this has a few characteristics. These aren't all of them, but these are the main ones. Untrammeled. This is a term that's often confused. It doesn't mean untrampled. A trammel is a horse hobble. And so what it means is freedom from human control, manipulation, or limitation. Undeveloped is essentially without permanent structures, enhancements, or modern human occupation, and natural, substantially free from the effect of modern civilization. One way to think of natural is basically it contains a lot of the original constituents that would define the area. Solitude and primitive recreation, self-reliant, challenging, non-motorized, non-mechanized recreational experience is a haven for self-discovery and rejuvenation, a refuge from civilization. So wilderness is related to the term wildness, as is the term untrammeled. Thoreau most famously wrote about wildness in his essay, Walking or the Wild. He wrote, "In wildness is the preservation of the world." This is also commonly mistaken for "in wilderness is the preservation of the world." So wildness has this etymology of something like self-willed, although there's some debate about where the word truly comes from, which seems to imply agency of land and animals. And I'll come back to talk about that if I have time. I hope I do. Untrammeled is the legal term, which is essentially like a legal equivalent of wildness. So it doesn't mean untrampled. In other words, it's not untouched or totally apart from human connection, although it can mean this. So critiques of pristine nature are therefore misplaced. It does mean unhobbled or unrestrained. So it's essentially the same as wildness. However, wildness is not the same as untrammeled in a crucial sense. Wildness is the basic background condition of the earth and the universe. Untrammeled is, however, a moral relationship of humility and restraint. So basically, untrammeled comes after we realize our own power and our ability to dominate, and we say, hey, let's purposefully leave some areas where we choose not to be in control of that area. That's the difference. And wildness would have just been there before we made that choice. So that's the main conceptual distinction between the two. So untrammeled or wildness, it means a freely evolving process, having no predetermined goal or constraining management interventions. And Howard Zonnheiser, the architect of the Wilderness Act, spoke of the free play of natural forces to describe this idea. Oops. So uses that we often associate, maybe more often associate with wilderness, include recreation. I'm just showing some pictures in the Brooks Range of people recreating, including myself. So Gates of the Arctic is meant to be both preserve a homeland for the Nunamiut Inupiat and a wilderness. And one of the ways that they have represented this idea and tried to toe this line on their website, and this is a bit old, they've replaced this now, but I kind of like how they've gone about it. Discover a premier wilderness. This vast landscape does not contain any roads or trails. Visitors discover intact ecosystems where people have lived with the land for thousands of years. People have been a part of the ecosystem here for over 13,000 years. Nomadic hunters and gatherers traveled between the mountains, forested southern slopes, and the Arctic coast. Now their descendants depend on and use park and preserve resources. So now I'll start moving more into the issue that I was working on. So things like this, these tukalit, which aren't quite the same as Inuksuk, but we can say Inuksuk, that's kind of a common name. But these were markers for hunting and navigation. But basically, these kind of impacts are considered actually part of the essence of wilderness. These are fully appropriate and belong there. And Bob Marshall, who was a wilderness, or an early Euro-American we'd call explorer of the Brooks Range, and wrote about the area, and also was one of the first to advocate for its protection. It was a member of the Wilderness Society, wrote, this is not a policy statement, but just his own statement. Trails and temporary shelters, which were common long before the advent of the white race, are entirely permissible. So even just from the idea is that even from the beginnings of the idea of wilderness as a protection category, it would rightfully include some of these kind of what we would say might call impacts. And what you're seeing are these like markers for navigation or hunting. And this little rock ring are actually, and these are all from the area, the Brooks Range. These would have been placed on caribou skin tents. And so these rocks might have been left in certain areas where the Nunamiut would return to and say, oh, those rocks are already in place, but we have our caribou skin tent with us, and they weigh down the outside. And so you can still find these. And then where this person is here, this is a caribou blind, and these are intermittently throughout the landscape, but basically a person could hide inside there, and when the caribou comes, it's for hunting. And what you're seeing in the center is a caribou trail. Now, what would be considered incompatible with wilderness are impacts from ATVs, which can be quite damaging to these ecosystems in terms of erosion and things like that. And in terms of compatibility with wilderness, they are noisy, so they don't give a sense of you don't get silence and solitude. So these are considered incompatible uses. So ANILCA allows non-conforming pre-existing prior to 1980 uses, specifically mentioning snow machines, motorboats, and planes if traditionally employed, but not mentioning ATVs. And this is like the densest I'm going to get into the law before I move away from some of the dense policy language. Traditional use includes subsistence and access to home sites and inholdings. This is required to assure adequate and feasible access for economic and other purposes. But this raises questions. What is traditional and what is adequate? For instance, is recreation a traditional activity? Clearly, people had always been recreating in some way in this area. That would be the kind of question that this raises. A Senate report on ANILCA states that restriction of subsistence to customary and traditional uses shall in no way impede the use of new technology for subsistence purposes. Now, this raises another question. What is customary? And this seems to imply that, therefore, ATVs would be compatible with subsistence use. Yet, ATVs are environmentally destructive, and Inupiat Land Exchange of 1996 specifically disallowed ATV use. And ATVs were deemed non-traditional in 1980 by the National Park Service. Snow machines and motorboats are given, and airplanes are given explicit exemptions in ANILCA, but ATVs are not. And they had more widespread use. Snow machines had more widespread use in 1980 than ATVs. So these are considered traditional in that sense, in both of those senses. So this is just offers some perspective on the ways that subsistence access and hunting takes place in the area. These are residents using Argos for subsistence. And just to illustrate this dichotomy of traditional use versus modern use, these are hunters on a North Slope or an ocean community hunting whales using a traditional boat versus motorboats, which are more commonly used today. So I'll get into the actual project so that's the policy context that basically contextualize the project that I conducted. And so what I did is I conducted interviews to gather local climate change observations within this policy context. And I also interviewed former park managers about how they interpreted this idea of traditional in relation to subsistence access. And then I synthesized scientific climate change materials into a lit review. So the basic policy issue was, with climate change, is climate change significantly shortening periods of snow machine access? And is that therefore impeding subsistence access to the gates of the Arctic National Park? That's the very simple, and I use it as an opportunity to dig into that, but also to get a broader sense of how climate change might be impacting residents, and also to get a sense of how they're understanding some of these issues. So I went to Inupiat Pass. I spent about a month in Inupiat Pass in 2016 and then returned for a couple of weeks in 2018. And what I discovered is that conducting a study like this is a bit complicated. There are a lot of entities I had to navigate. And I had to go to at least 3 just within this village of about 325 people to sort of connect with the right people to get proper permissions, including the city, the tribal council, and the Nunamiut Corporation. But there are many other players at play as well. And one way that I attempted to reach out to people who might have the right kind of knowledge, especially active, what I wanted was active subsistence users, especially if they had a long relationship of subsistence access with the land, so that they could tell me basically what's changing over time, how are things now, and how do they compare with the past. So I put out some flyers around town. I organized a film screening, but ultimately, it was just meeting the right people and totally happenstance. Those basically failed completely. I just met the right people, or someone emailed me and said, "Hey, you should come talk to me." But I did meet some really interesting and basically the type of people that I was looking to meet, and I did end up interviewing them. So this map shows Inupiat Pass. It shows all the subsistence resources in the area that Inupiat Pass residents collect. And I'm not going to go through this, but you can see there are a ton. But caribou is the most significant. So the Nunamiut consider themselves people of the caribou, and the same way that other people in the area, like the Gwich'in, do as well. But there are a whole variety of other things as well. This is showing actually one of the hunters that I talked to using a snow machine for subsistence purposes in the area. And this is actually his house. And I didn't take either of these photos either. I wasn't there in the winter. So these are some major themes of the interviews. So one resident said, we're in the middle of a parks that we can't go out of unless there is snow and ice. And what if we can't leave our lands? That's something to think about. How our environment changes actually impacts people in the law. There's a lot of stuff happening quickly in the laws I don't think are catching up. And that's what I was trying to assess. Is that true? So in terms of snow machine access, the summers grew longer where I can have my machine maybe 8 months out of the year, and you only have 4 months of good hard snow. But global warming might be some changes in some of our seasons because I can go out longer with my 8-wheeler than before my uncles and my grandpas used to have. Another resident said, I don't travel as fast anymore just because we don't have as much snow cover. I have to slow my speeds down because now we have exposed rocks and I'm dodging boulders and whatnot. Or we won't be able to use the snow machine soon. So basically what I deduced from talking to them is that snow machine season was impeded for about a month on either side of midwinter, basically into the spring and fall, but it can be extended, but with more hazards, especially exposed rocks and open creeks, which may entail higher maintenance costs. So the true loss where you can't use the snow machine at all is at least a week in both fall and spring. Now, this was a number of years ago, and it was a short-term study, so and it's changing really, really quickly. So I imagine this is already out of date. I'm going to start moving quickly because I realize I'm not even going to get to my second part at all in terms of these interviews. But basically, animals had been changing. There were larger caribou migrations going back to the 90s that didn't come through Inupiat anymore. The reasons for that are quite complicated. I'm not going to get into it, but basically, more sport hunters was a common reason given in the BLM lands to the north. There are issues with midwinter rains, freezing, and there is a nearby road, and a recent study just came out, effects of vehicle traffic on space use and road crossings of caribou in the Arctic. And the takeaway is that past studies suggested that caribou exhibit behavioral responses when traffic exceeds 15 vehicles an hour. But our results demonstrate behavioral responses at much lower traffic levels. Our results illustrate that vehicle activity mediates caribou responses. So basically, the nearby haul road could actually be more impactful on caribou than previously thought. And then, of course, there's climate change and a lot of other issues. So access was changing in terms of river ice. So that's a common transportation corridor. It's getting more unreliable. The weather's becoming more unreliable, things you would expect. But I'm going to skip through this a little bit more quickly. One thing I'll say about Inupiat Pass is there's less permafrost in the area, so issues of permafrost melt are less prevalent there. But as you go to the North Slope, this becomes a really, really big issue. I'm going to skip over this, understandings of climate change, risk perception, and other things. There's some really interesting stuff there. Maybe we can talk about it in questions if you'd like me to return to it. Okay, so a closing thought on part one comes from a former National Park Service subsistence coordinator. Traditional subsistence was practiced in the Alaska parks for thousands of years, yet those same areas were only lightly affected and retained their wilderness character. The real challenge of subsistence management is how to reasonably accommodate subsistence without losing the fragile beauty on which it thrives. And this is the Inupiat Pass village in the center down there. And that's obviously Inupiat Pass. So part two, unfortunately, I won't be able to get into the depth of this like philosophical investigation, but at least want to I already broached the topic, but I want to get into it at least a little bit more deeply. And I hope I'm not just opening up something and leaving you hanging, but I'm going to try. So I just heard this radio show the other day on NPR, which is U.S. National Public Radio. It's something called StoryCorps. It says 2 friends in Alaska discuss losing so many people to suicide. And one of the concluding remarks, it was basically these 2 friends talking. One said, I appreciate you, man. We need to get out on the land together and just go spend some time in the wilderness. And the other says, absolutely, that's my medicine. So that really stood out to me, this use of the term wilderness and the context in which it, basically this like healing property that our lives, that we need as a part of our lives. And just think about that as I move into this next part. But that resonated with me. I was like, yeah, that makes sense. I'm going to skip that. So just really quickly, wilderness has been critiqued by some. And some really nice synopses of the critiques are in two books that I read recently, Driven Wild by Paul Sutter and Rethinking Wilderness by Mark Woods. I'm not even going to read all of these because I want to just give you a super quick version of this. But often the main takeaway I want to give you is that often this term by wilderness critics, they season this term pristine, implying something like erasure, that wilderness as an idea and as a reality implicitly and explicitly just erases indigenous people. And it's like this empty landscape. But I'm here to tell you that that's not true. And Kenneth Brower has called this the myth of wilderness. And there are other critiques as well, but I'm not going to, there's far more here I wish I could share with you. But I'll just point out that Bob Marshall, who was in the Wilderness Society, actually spent a lot of time with the people of Alaska when he was in this area. He wrote two books, one called Alaska Wilderness and another called Arctic Village. And the one on Arctic Village is centered on the people who were using and living in this region, which included, of course, native inhabitants of the area. There's a lot more I wanted to give you, but I'll just point out that Tom Kizzy, an Alaskan writer, commented on Marshall. He wrote, Marshall's writing refuted racial stereotypes of his day, emphasizing to a national audience the wit and superior intelligence of his Eskimo friends and wise men. And I'm not going to read you this, but it's super interesting. It's refuting some of these critiques. The one that I wanted to seize on particularly was what I have been formulating over some years, and I call it the incompatibility critique. It's often embedded in other critiques of wilderness, but it's kind of its own. Basically, as interpreted by some, there is an insurmountable conflict between indigenous ideas of nature and non-indigenous, including wilderness, which these critics interpret as a paradigmatic example of nature apart from culture. Another way of stating is that there's a conceptual schism between indigenous and so-called Western conceptions of nature and the human place in it. It's often stated something like indigenous people had no word for wilderness. And kind of a preeminent example of this that's often cited is Chief Luther Standing Bear's statement, "We did not think of the great open plains, the beautiful rolling hills and winding streams with tangled growth as wild. Only to the white man was nature a wilderness, and only to him was the land infested with wild animals and savage people. To us, it was tame." So just really quickly on this, as Mark Woods notes that J. Hansford Vest, a Monacan Indian, basically argues that Standing Bear has been misinterpreted. For Standing Bear, the terms wild and wilderness are pejorative terms from Euro-Americans that were applied to American Indian lands and American Indians themselves. But there's actually a lot of overlap in considering nature to have a kind of intrinsic value. That's his position there. So basically, this comes from a time where wilderness was also devalued in similar ways. But the sense of wilderness has shifted over time. That's one way to interpret this. Now, I'm going to end with this. I had a lot more. I was getting a lot more deep into some of this, but I'll just note two indigenous scholars who have these statements, and then we can wrap this up. Although the word, well, actually, I'll do one more slide. Although the word wild does not exist in the Raramari or other American Indian vocabularies, I can appreciate the concept of wild and wildness in its current context. And it is true that my Supik ancestors had no word for wilderness, nor do we have words for airplanes, computers, or the internet, or for climate change, endangered species, or biodiversity either. But we've adopted these words and concepts for the modern, altered, and changing world we now live in. So I had a lot more on this, as you can see, and I was getting a lot more analytical in my, basically this is entirely other presentation I'm realizing. I'll just point out in Montana, there's something called the Mission Mountains Tribal Wilderness, and it's run by the Salish Kootenai tribes on their reservation land. So this indicates, at least to some degree, that there is a compatibility here. Of course, there are some different conceptualizations attached to it and uses. So let me just end with this, wilderness in a nutshell. And a lot of the argument for this slide I haven't given you, but wilderness exists as a place and as a concept. Wilderness as a concept is complex and has a history of development like everything else. Wilderness may exist in the contemporary world as either a deliberately protected or de facto undeveloped place. Wilderness as a formally protected area is set aside in a state of wildness or untrammeled, along with other characteristics like undeveloped naturalness, etc. Wilderness as a condition of the earth predates humanity by billions of years and existed alongside and often included humanity for millions more, and in many places still does. The dominant condition of the earth is, however, no longer wilderness. Wilderness as a preservation goal and environmental policy emerged at a particular historic moment as an evolving ethical response to contemporary ecological and technological conditions. However, its historical contingency as a preservation category does not make it a so-called construct. Wilderness, whether formally protected or not, need not, but often can and should include human connections and relationships, including those of indigenous people. Within the expanse of human habitation on Earth, there have always been less traffic in inhabited portions of the world, and though cultures interpret these areas somewhat differently, there are many instances of shared understanding. And finally, differences in conceptualizations of undeveloped landscapes between indigenous and non-indigenous people should be recognized and appreciated, but are not insurmountable and in fact overlap in substantial ways. So I certainly reached my time, so I'm going to wrap up with that and leave it open for questions. And if you'd like to talk to me about what I wanted to tell you on the more philosophical and conceptual side of things, I'm happy to do so, or I could give another presentation another time. But
Thanks a lot. I'm pretty sure there were a lot of questions, and it fits also very well to our course that we are going on wilderness and ethical issues, considerations. Thank you very much. It was very illustrative.
For your interviews, so you interviewed people whom you could.
oh yeah, I should give you this because there are people online that can't hear you, so we should use this.
I will turn it on, and then
We're just setting up for anyone who's
Nata?
joining us online. We're setting up a small mic
Yes.
for a question. Maybe.
I'm always afraid from microphones.
Oh.
About your interviews, so you interviewed only the people, not only, but people who you could meet, or you tried to make the interviews representative of the region?
Well, so I was looking for a specific demographic, which are active subsistence users, especially, well, that was the main one, but especially those who would have had a long-standing relationship, or I'm saying the word relationship, but basically would have been going out into the park, into surrounding areas for a very long time. So elders are a really good source for that, especially elders that were still active. And I did find the key individuals, we'd say, not all, but certain key individuals. So it was representative in the sense, well, it was partly who was willing to talk to me. That was the main thing. Who was willing to talk to me of the people that meet that criteria. So I wasn't asking, because a lot of people, so it's historically a native village, but all kinds of people can live there. It's not restricted to a certain ethnicity that can live in this village or in other Alaskan villages, but it is more representative in that way. But also a lot of people, even native community members, don't hunt, don't necessarily go out for subsistence as much as others. And of course, hunting is not the only form. So it had to be people that were active, that were really, really paying attention to the landscape and what's going on, and had some perspective on how it might be changing.
Thank you.
I just give it. Was there a question?
Oh,
No,
I guess if
no.
I had the microphone, that's good.
Okay.
Yeah, that's a good way to do it. Just pass, and you're forced to ask a question.
Running.
Okay, so the inevitable philosophical question for you. You mentioned
We have an actual philosopher here, by the way.
ex-philosopher.
Ex-philosopher, yes.
I try. So you mentioned the loaded term, intrinsic value. So as you know from all your work in philosophy, if you define values, typically they rest on a natural property. So you've got the value properties that rest on, or non-natural properties that rest on natural properties. So what properties of wildness, of wilderness, do you think ground the claim that it has intrinsic value? What features?
So I think I've mentioned to you, Eric, that I've avoided basically the entire intrinsic value discussion, but I was just opening the possibility that there might be intrinsic values that, because that definition was so centered on explicitly anthropocentric instrumental values. I was just leaving open the possibility that we might say that there are intrinsic values that, apart from us. I don't know the answer to what would ground those values, but yeah, so I don't know. That's the best philosophic answer, actually. I don't know.
I wasn't trying
Yeah,
to
yeah.
get some detailed
Yeah, yeah.
definition to then chip away at, but just your sense, because if
Yeah, well, here's one answer for you. And actually, I've been trying to, I wrote a paper that I'm trying to develop and get published. One, here, actually related to some of the latter part of the presentation, I wasn't able to get into as much depth. But one argument I've tried to hold to make is that there are actually a lot of overlaps between wilderness thinkers and indigenous thinkers about land. And one way I think that they overlap is to see the meaning and the value as not something that they're projecting onto the landscape, but something that's coming out of the landscape to them as they participate and spend time in those landscapes. And so that, to me, and which includes, I think, this sense of wildness, that you're in contact with something else besides yourself that you're relating to in a particular kind of way, and it's giving you something. And that's the sense that I would have of like how we could have a sense of intrinsic value in a way that isn't just like maybe some distant star has intrinsic value, but that's not something we don't need to think about it. It doesn't matter to us. But this is a way that I can like say something about it. It's like when I go there, I have this kind of experience, and this is the way I think of it. And I will say I guess, because I do think of it that way also. But that would be a kind of grounding for this sense that the value isn't something that I'm just adding on to this empty kind of valueless space. So that would be, I think, the best answer I can give you, which is maybe in the intrinsic value literature, people are saying that, and I'm just rehashing it. I don't know, because I haven't really gotten too deep into that. But
well, I think that's really nice.
Yeah.
I guess people just divide up these values into different ones. So I was wondering if you're moving it towards something that maybe people think of as aesthetic values. Something that's there,
so
that's absorbed from the environment, the look, the layout, the sweeping landscapes.
Yeah. So I think that's right. And actually, I'm trying to develop this too. So I think of, I would say aesthetic in a broader sense, which includes like an immersion or a direct contact with this. It's like an interactive aesthetics, and you're getting not just like this, because aesthetics often has this sense of like scenery, or even not even just beauty, but like a full sensory connection to a place. That's how, if and that would relate to what I was describing earlier. That would be a broader sense of aesthetics, and I think that would draw those connections together.
Nice, thank you.
Yes.
Yeah, first of all, thank you very much for your presentation. It was very informative. We heard quite a bit about the perceived conflict between traditional indigenous subsistence use and the maybe Western concept of wilderness protection. And I'd like to draw out an extreme in that conflict, if I may.
Sure.
Let's say that a government deems that there is such a conflict between these traditional users and the protection of wilderness. Should the government be allowed to regulate these subsistence users to an extent that endangers the very indigenous existence? I think I'd like to refer to the example of the snowmobile exemption and climate change, in which the regulation of government might even endanger these traditional subsistence users.
Yeah, I mean, that's the crux of the whole matter. And that's where this becomes, like, on its surface, this seems like kind of a mundane use of vehicles. But when you get into a little more depth, yeah, it is about cultural persistence versus the persistence of something that we would call wilderness, which includes the opportunity to experience a landscape that isn't heavily modified and where you can experience silence and solitude, for instance. And well, I mean, the law, if we look at it from a legal standpoint, the laws indicate that we should be doing both. But this is all written before climate change arrived. And so let's push it to its limit and say, let's say that the loss of snow cover did become such a massive issue that it did unduly constrain subsistence activities such that subsistence lifestyle and native cultural survival in this place couldn't continue. I don't know how the science, how likely that would be, but let's just say, should wilderness be compromised for the sake of this, basically expanding ATV use in the area? Well, actually, let me backtrack one thing. First of all, there are traditional means of subsistence access, which were on foot. And so it is an interesting, basically, I don't know the answer. Clearly, probably there would need to be some compromise. I would say that the wilderness aspect should compromise more than the native aspect. That there should be expanded ATV use. I think that's my short answer to that. Is that getting at what you're actually asking?
Sure. Yeah.
But there are so many complicated layers here. Like living in a village in a set place was never part of the tradition of this area. Using any kind of machinery was never part of the subsistence tradition of this area. And so, yeah, it's a lot. I don't know the answers here. I'm just trying to lay out some of the conflicts that I am wrestling with in your question and in this case. Like there are already things, and so one thing I didn't mention actually is that the reason that the village was settled at all was because the residents wanted access to airplanes, they wanted access to schools, to post office. Basically, they wanted to be connected to the outside world, even if that did compromise this like at least multi-thousand year tradition of semi-nomadism within the range. And so when you make that compromise, there might be other compromises that come along with it, maybe even unanticipated by those original settlers. And it's like, well, because we live here, maybe because of other reasons, the large herds aren't coming through here. So we need to go further for certain things. But yeah, I'm not answering the question. I'm just more adding layers to the complexity of the issue. Maybe in a helpful way, maybe not.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But this was not climate change for the subsistence access with snowmobiles, and distinguishing these access from recreational access with snowmobiles. And there we have court decisions meanwhile, and this also took a long time of taking, but I think there have been no court decisions so far for these impacts on climate change and how this affects the balancing of these different interests. So that's why the answer cannot be that short, I guess.
Yeah, I can add a couple of things to what she was saying, though. I think the case she's referring to is in so Denali was like an old park called Mount McKinley National Park that was massively expanded with Anoka into what is now Denali National Park and Preserve. And I think the case she's referring to refers to the old park, which is the only wilderness section of Denali, which that wilderness section of Denali was exempted from the exemptions of Anoka that allowed snow machine and other subsistence access. So basically, the Anoka additions allow subsistence access, but not the core wilderness old part of Denali. And I think that's the part she's referring to where that was settled, but that it's almost like a different set of laws that apply to that versus the new part. So, and I do know there was a case in Boundary Waters where motorboat, it was kind of a similar issue with motorboat, it had nothing to do with climate change, but motorboats were being used for subsistence to cut across wilderness, and it went to court, and I don't remember the outcomes of that actually, but there are some precedents, but maybe not specifically related to climate change. Yes.
I'm wondering if throughout the course of your interviews, if you ever come across the sentiment that the enforcement of these Western concepts of wilderness protection is just colonialism by another mean.
Yeah, so that's part of what I was sort of addressing in the second part. That would be the main criticism that I do address, and but not fully. So I think that it's a valid critique, and what I tried to offer in the presentation was the context for why wilderness protection took place in the first place. And let's just stick with the Brooks Range. Basically, if that hadn't happened, Anaktuvuk Pass would have had a road and an oil pipeline running right through it, likely. And who knows what else? Who, like, probably most of the range would have been developed for resource extraction, and the subsistence lifestyle would have been erased anyway, probably even more so. And so this wilderness park was perhaps arguably crucial in keeping this subsistence cultural tradition alive. And so you could argue the opposite. You could say this was kind of reacting to this exploitative colonial logic of what should happen to Alaska. And I think that a lot of these wilderness thinkers wouldn't use those exact terms, but would be thinking that they similarly, that they're trying to keep something at bay that's detrimental to these populations. Now, there are a lot of issues of consultation and representation in these processes of creating wilderness, designating wilderness. That's undeniable. And some about how these laws panned out over time, but I'd say it's way more complicated than that. And it often gets so simplified into this binary of colonial, not colonial, or something like that. And I don't think that's a fair binary at all. I think there's many more layers and much more complexity, and that's part of what I was trying to highlight. Now, Inupiat did build in like certain kind of representational elements, like the subsistence resource councils. I wasn't doing a long-term study on how effective those are in representing native populations or anything like that, so I can't comment on that. But I think that's the best answer I have in general.
Yeah, thank you very much for your thoughts, Chris.
Okay, I think we are almost at the end. Thank you very much for your attention. Are there any pressing questions from the auditorium? No. So thank you very much, Chris. It was very insightful. We would wish to have more time, but we are really looking forward to what comes out also from your studies here. And thank you for having you here.
Thank you for coming.
Thanks a lot.